The flickering porch light buzzed above me as I opened the door and found my son hiding a child I'd never met. Still, I kept my voice calm, letting my fingers rest on that trembling bulb as if it could steady my breath. As the buzzing deepened, it echoed through the hallway, peeling back every lie he tried to rush past me. While he searched for excuses, that same harsh light exposed the fear he couldn't hide. The same buzzing told me the truth. This betrayal had lived in our home far longer than I realized. That's when I decided, if he hid my own blood from me, then justice would arrive quiet and final. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Rick Dalton hadn't planned on driving across Denver that morning. He'd woken up with the same hollow ache he had carried since his wife passed away, an ache that sharpened every time he thought about how distant his relationship with his son had become. Months had gone by with only short texts from Evan, each one colder and more rushed than the last. Rick kept telling himself his son was just busy, stressed, caught up in work. But there was always something in the tone, something trembling underneath the surface, that made the old man feel shut out. That morning he'd stood in his quiet kitchen, staring at the worn photograph of Evan as a boy, grinning, holding a toy fire truck. Rick used to think that smile would last forever. Now he barely saw the grown man it belonged to. Something snapped inside him. Enough waiting. Enough assuming everything was fine when every instinct told him it was. So he cooked. A full tray of the chicken casserole Evan used to beg for when he was 10. Then a loaf of cornbread, wrapped in the same towel his wife once used. And because Rick couldn't show up empty-handed after so long, he packed a small box, nothing fancy, just a couple of things he'd picked up on sale months earlier because Evan might like them someday. Someday had to be today. He loaded the food into his old truck, checked the address again even though he knew it by heart, and started the 40-minute drive across town. Denver rolled by in fragments, quiet neighborhoods, dog walkers, morning sun hitting the roofs just right, but Rick noticed none of it. His mind kept circling the same questions. Why had Evan pulled away? Why did he sound so strained every time they talked? Why did he avoid every invitation, every simple family moment? By the time Rick pulled up to Evan's apartment complex, his hands were sweating around the wheel. He wiped them on his jeans, grabbed the casserole tray and gift box, and forced himself to breathe. "This is good," he whispered to himself. "This is what a father does." He walked down the hallway, counting the doors without meaning to, and stopped in front of Evan's unit. The doormat was clean but not welcoming. No plants, no sign of warmth, nothing like the home Evan grew up in. Rick's stomach tightened. He knocked. A pause. Footsteps. Then the door cracked open, just enough for Evan to peek through. Rick smiled, trying to keep it light. "Surprise, kiddo." Evan didn't smile back. His eyes widened, startled, tense, almost frightened, as he pulled the door closer against his body. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Rick lifted the casserole between them, trying to keep the moment normal. "Thought I'd come by, brought you lunch, and us some things." Instead of softening, Evan swallowed hard and glanced over his shoulder. A shadow crossed his face, something nervous, something protective. Rick's chest tightened. "Everything okay?" Before Evan could answer, a small sound drifted down the hallway behind him. A tiny giggle, light, unmistakably a child's. Rick blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard it right. Maybe a TV, maybe a neighbor. But Evan froze, and the panic in his eyes sharpened into something unmistakable. "Evan, what was that?" Rick whispered. It's nothing," Evan said quickly, stepping forward as if to block any view inside. Just Dad, I wasn't expecting you." Rick didn't push, but the old firefighter in him felt the heat of a lie before it ever caught flame. He tilted his head slightly, trying to look past Evan's shoulder. Then it happened. A tiny set of footsteps pattered across the hardwood floor, and a little girl, 3 years old at most, raced into the hallway behind Evan, dark hair in uneven pigtails, a small stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand, and eyes. Rick's heart slammed against his ribs. Eyes exactly like his. Evan spun around too late. The child skid to a stop, looked up curiously at the stranger on the doorstep, and Rick felt the world tilt beneath him. Everything slowed. The casserole grew heavy in his hands. Air caught halfway in his lungs. He didn't speak, couldn't. And Evan reacted like a man whose carefully built world had just cracked open. "Hazel, sweetheart, go back inside," Evan stammered, stepping sideways to block her view. His voice trembled. "Go back to your toys, okay?" But Hazel stayed where she was, staring around Evan's legs at the man with the same eyes she had. Rick managed to whisper, voice shaking, "Evan, who is that?" Evan didn't answer right away. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again as though the words were fighting him from the inside. Rick felt the silence like pressure against his skull. He kept staring at the little girl. No, hazel-eyed little girl, because her presence, her face, her small tilted smile, all of it hit deeper than anything he'd prepared himself for. Finally, with a shaky breath, Evan said it. She's my daughter, Dad. Her name is Hazel." The world didn't just stop, it split. Rick's knees felt unsteady and he had to shift his grip on the casserole to keep it from sliding out of his hands. A granddaughter, his granddaughter, 3 years old at least. 3 years he'd never known existed. 3 years of birthdays, little shoes, first words, all gone, kept from him. Rick swallowed, but his throat felt raw. He didn't trust himself to speak. Evan kept blocking the doorway, palms pressed against the frame as though Rick were a threat. "Dad, listen, this isn't how I wanted you to find out." "How you wanted," Rick finally whispered, each word scraping its way out. "Evan, this is a child, your child. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me?" "I can't explain right now." That set something burning low in Rick's chest. A quiet old fire. Not the roaring kind from his youth, the ones he fought in buildings. This one was smaller, deeper, the kind that smoldered for years before anyone noticed. He stared straight at his son. "Not right now," he repeated, voice rough. "You had 3 years." Evan blinked, guilt flashing through his expression. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once behind Hazel as though trapped. "Dad, it's complicated. You showing up out of nowhere. It's not safe for her to, just Dad, please, not today." Rick felt the sting of that word. Safe. As if he was danger. As if his presence threatened the little girl who shared his eyes, his blood, his history. Hazel, oblivious to the tension, slipped around Evan's leg and wandered a step closer to Rick. She had a tiny frown on her face, the curious kind children make when they meet someone they instinctively sense they should know. She just looked at him. Rick didn't breathe. He didn't move. Something inside him cracked open, something fragile, something he'd shut off after losing his wife. Hazel tilted her head. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Hi." Rick's heart nearly buckled. But the moment shattered in an instant. "Hazel, sweetheart, come here," Evan insisted, scooping her up before she got any closer. His hands trembled as he pulled her to his chest, holding her too tightly, like he feared someone would take her. Rick saw the fear, yes, but he also saw something else. Panic, secrets, a kind of guilt that didn't come from simple embarrassment. Something darker was tangled in this. Rick forced his voice steady. "Evan, why hide her from me? What are you so scared of?" "I said not now," Evan snapped, not cruelly but with a desperation that made Rick's stomach twist. He adjusted Hazel on his hip, kissing her hair as if grounding himself. "Just Dad, go home, please. I'll call you later, I promise." Hazel looked over Evan's shoulder at Rick as she was carried away, her small hand reaching out in the air for something she didn't have words for. That image pierced deeper than Evan could ever know. The door started to close. Rick didn't fight it. He didn't shout, didn't push, didn't plead. He simply stepped back, breath shaking, casserole cooling in his arms like a reminder of a life that didn't fit anymore. "Okay," he said quietly, "but I'm not walking away from this, Evan. Not again." Evan paused mid-close. His eyes flickered with something, regret maybe, but he still shut the door, softly but with finality. The hallway felt colder immediately. Rick stood there for a long moment, letting the weight settle in. 3 years, a granddaughter he didn't know existed, a son hiding a child as though she were a crime, and worse, the tremor in Evan's voice, the fear behind his eyes, none of it made sense. None of it felt like Evan was just being selfish or forgetful. No, this was something else. Rick walked out of the building slowly, the casserole still untouched, his hands rigid around the dish. Once outside, he set the tray on the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands, staring straight ahead. There was only one truth he felt in his bones. Whatever Evan was hiding, it wasn't small. And it didn't just threaten his son. It threatened Hazel. Rick exhaled deeply, the vow forming in his chest like steel hardening. "I'll find out," he murmured into the quiet truck. "I'll learn everything, no matter what it takes." And with that he started the engine, heart shattered. Suspicion sharpened and purpose ignited, knowing today was only the beginning. Rick didn't sleep that night. He tried, God knows he tried, but every time he closed his eyes he saw Hazel's face. Those familiar eyes, that shy curiosity, the way Evan held her as though the world might snatch her away if he loosened his grip. Rick lay awake until dawn, the unanswered questions burning circles through his mind. By mid-morning, he knew he couldn't sit in silence another minute. If Evan wouldn't tell him the truth, someone else might. And the only person who had been consistently close to his son these past few years was Edith Clark, the 76-year-old widow who lived 2 doors down from Rick. Sharp as a tack, observant to the point of unnerving, Edith noticed things most people didn't. Rick walked across the street and found her watering her roses. She looked up the second she sensed him. "You have that look," she said without greeting. "The same one you had when Evan broke his arm falling out of your apple tree." Rick tried for a smile but couldn't hold it. "Edith, I need to ask you something about Evan." Her expression softened. She put down her watering can and motioned him toward her porch chairs. "Sit. Tell me what happened." Rick did all of it, the surprise visit, Hazel, the secrecy, the tension in Evan's voice. Edith listened without interrupting, her brows tightening inch by inch. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "Rick, I didn't want to say anything before because it wasn't my place, but now I think you need to know." Rick leaned forward. "Know what?" "Your son hasn't been himself for years," she said gently. "Not since, maybe 3.5 years ago. He started coming home late, jumpy, quiet, like someone waiting for bad news." Rick felt his pulse spike. "That lines up with Hazel's age." Edith nodded. "I suspected as much when you said she looked like you." She paused, lowering her voice. "There was one night in particular I've never forgotten. I heard a woman crying, not loud, but desperate, and a child too whimpering like they were scared. The sound came from Evan's place." Rick's heart clenched. "You're sure?" "As sure as I am that these roses aren't going to bloom right this year," she said. "I went to check, but by the time I got into the hallway it was quiet. Evan answered the door looking shaken, pale. He said everything was fine, but it was." Rick sat back, breath heavy. A woman and a crying child. That could only mean Hazel, and what was her name? Lara, the mother Evan wouldn't mention. The mother he apparently had a complicated past with. Edith touched his arm. "Rick, I think your son's been carrying something alone, something heavy." Rick didn't trust his voice. He simply nodded. Back home, he opened his laptop and typed Lara Denver into the search bar. Then Lara-Evan relationship. Nothing useful. He added Hazel. Too broad. Too many results. But then he remembered the name he'd heard Hazel say while clutching her stuffed rabbit, "Bunny likes mama." Mama Lara. He tried again. Lara Bennett, Denver. This time, profiles appeared. He clicked the first social media account and froze. The banner photo at the top showed a little girl with a dimpled smile and messy pigtails, Hazel, clear as day, standing beside a woman who looked exhausted but kind, her arm protectively wrapped around her daughter. Rick's breath hitched when he zoomed in. Hazel's smile, that was his smile. The exact same curl of the left corner, the same squint in the eyes. And behind them, in older photos, Rick noticed dates that aligned perfectly with the months Evan disappeared from family gatherings. Holidays Evan couldn't make. Birthdays he worked late. Times Rick assumed were just growing distance. He swallowed hard. My God, Evan was with them. He scrolled until he found a photo from 3 years ago. Lara holding newborn Hazel. Evan wasn't in the picture, but the timestamp matched the week Evan had gone completely silent, the period when Rick assumed his son was grieving privately for his mother. Instead, Evan had been welcoming a daughter Rick never met. The betrayal stung, but beneath it was something deeper, fear. If Evan had hidden this for so long, something must have forced him to. Rick grabbed his phone and called Evan, straight to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. Evan, Rick said, keeping his voice steady, we need to talk. Please call me back. This is important. But he knew his son wasn't going to answer. Not today. Maybe not ever. Not until whatever had scared him into silence was dragged into the light. Rick closed the laptop slowly. His next step was clear, terrifyingly clear. If Evan wouldn't tell him the truth, he had to hear it from the source. Lara Bennett. He slipped his keys into his pocket, exhaling as a cold determination settled into place. Hazel's face flashed behind his eyes, frightened, curious, half reaching for him. Hang on, sweetheart, Rick whispered, I'll figure this out. With that, he headed for the door, knowing the answers he sought would not come easily, and knowing they would change everything. Rick Dalton didn't know what he expected when he typed Lara Bennett's workplace into his GPS, but the address surprised him. It wasn't a fancy office or some downtown studio. It was a modest, family-owned cafe tucked between a hardware store and an old bookstore on the quieter side of Denver. A place that smelled like warm bread and overworked dreams. Rick parked across the street and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He didn't rehearse what he was going to say because no words felt big enough. He only knew one thing. Hazel deserved safety, and Evan clearly hadn't been able to provide it alone. Rick stepped inside. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly. A few customers sipped coffee in quiet corners. Behind the counter, a woman was wiping down surfaces, her hair pulled into a loose bun that looked like it had been twisted in a rush. Her posture was tired but careful, protective. Rick recognized her instantly, Lara. She looked up and stopped breathing. The cloth slipped from her hand. Mr. Dalton, she whispered. Her voice cracked on his name like she'd said it before, maybe in anger, maybe in regret, maybe in prayer. Rick stepped forward slowly, not wanting to startle her. Lara, I'm Rick, Evan's father. I know who you are. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with something deeper, something overwhelmed. She glanced toward the back of the cafe, then back at him. You shouldn't be here. Rick felt a small twist in his gut. I think I should. I found out about Hazel yesterday. Lara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the emotion was heavier. You saw her. I did. Her breath trembled. She motioned him toward a small table in the corner, one she'd probably chosen because it was the least visible. Rick sat across from her, watching the way her hands shook as she folded napkins unnecessarily, trying to keep them busy. I never wanted you to be dragged into this, she said softly. You seem like a good man. Rick leaned forward. I didn't come here to be protected. I came for the truth. Why didn't I know about my granddaughter? Lara swallowed hard, looking out the window as if searching for strength in the passing cars. Because Evan left. she whispered. He left when Hazel was barely a few months old. Rick's chest tightened. Left, why would he leave you, leave his own daughter? He didn't want to, Lara said quickly, shaking her head. Evan loved Hazel from the moment he held her. He loved her more than anything. But something happened, something that made him pull away, something I wasn't strong enough to fight alone. Rick felt the ground shift beneath him. What happened? Lara hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because saying it out loud seemed to hurt her physically. She looked down at her hands, then slowly rolled up the sleeve of her sweater. Rick's stomach dropped. Bruises, faded, yellowing marks circling her wrist like someone had grabbed her hard. His jaw clenched, fists tightening under the table. "Who did that to you?" he asked, barely keeping his voice level. Lara gently tugged the sleeve back down, shame and fear flickering across her face. "My boyfriend, Marlon." Rick blinked. "You're with someone now who hurts you." Lara let out a breath that sounded like defeat. It wasn't like that in the beginning. He was charming, helpful, protective. And after Evan left, I was alone, scared, trying to raise a baby. Marlon stepped in, made everything look easy, until it was. Rick leaned back, trying to process. And Evan, he knew about him. A shadow crossed her features. Yes, Marlon hated Evan from the start, said he was weak, said a real man doesn't run off even though Evan didn't want to leave us. But Marlon, he made threats, real threats. She looked Rick straight in the eye. Your son didn't walk away because he wanted to. He walked away because Marlon told him what would happen if he didn't. Rick felt the breath leave his body. Pieces of Evan's panic-filled reaction yesterday suddenly made horrifying sense. "Why didn't you call me?" Rick asked. "I could have helped. You didn't have to go through this alone." Lara's lips trembled. "Evan told me not to. He said involving you would only make things worse, that Marlon would see you as a threat too." Rick's pulse hammered. "He kept Hazel from me to protect me." Lara nodded slowly. Evan thought he was saving everyone by staying away, but he was breaking inside, and so was I. The weight of her words settled like a stone in Rick's chest. He remembered Hazel's small voice, her cautious smile. A child living in fear without understanding why. "Lara," Rick said softly, "you and Hazel deserve better than this. You both deserve safety." She looked away again, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "There's more," she whispered. "Marlon has been changing, getting worse, angrier. I'm scared he's going to do something none of us can undo." Rick's gaze dropped again to the faint bruises. He felt a slow, cold rage crawl through his bloodstream. Something darker was unfolding, something that had pulled Evan into silence, Lara into fear, and Hazel into danger she couldn't possibly understand. Rick exhaled, steadying himself. "Lara, I need to know everything, because I'm not leaving Hazel in harm's way, not again." And for the first time, Lara looked at him not with shock or fear, but with hope. Fragile hope, like a match struck in darkness. Lara didn't speak right away. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, steadying herself, as though the truth she'd been carrying had its own weight, one she wasn't sure her body could still manage. Rick waited. He didn't rush her. He'd seen victims struggle to find words before, grief and fear always tangled together in the same way. Finally she inhaled, shaky but determined. "Rick, there's something you do know. Something Evan never told you because he was trying to protect you." Rick felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Protect me from what?" "From Marlon," she whispered. Rick leaned back slightly, stunned by the simplicity of the name. Marlon, just a man, a boyfriend, someone who should have been a footnote in Lara's life. But the fear in her eyes told him this wasn't just about a difficult relationship or a controlling partner. This was something else, something heavier. "What did he do?" Rick asked, voice low. Lara took a breath, then dropped the bomb that froze everything inside him. "Marlon threatened to kill Evan if he kept contacting Hazel." The words cracked through the air like a shot. Rick didn't blink, didn't breathe. For a long moment he couldn't. Images flashed across his mind, Evan's trembling hands yesterday, the way he kept Hazel shielded behind him, the panic in his voice when Rick arrived unannounced. All of it sharpened into horrifying clarity. What do you mean, kill him?" Rick asked, trying to stay steady. "He told Evan outright," Lara said. "He said if Evan ever came near us again, ever tried to see Hazel, he'd make sure Evan disappeared. And he wasn't bluffing. I've seen him do things. He has friends who don't ask questions." Rick's heartbeat hammered in his ears. This wasn't an exaggeration, not fear talking. This was real. "So Evan stayed away because he thought it was the only way to keep Hazel safe," Rick whispered. Lara nodded. "And you?" "He was terrified Marlon would go after anyone connected to him. He told me once, before he finally backed off, that you were the one thing he couldn't risk. He said you, survived enough loss already." Rick closed his eyes. His son hadn't abandoned his child. He'd sacrificed every part of himself to keep her and Rick alive. That wasn't weakness. It wasn't neglect. It was survival. Rick's hands shook. Horrified didn't cover it. Gutted came closer. The idea of his son living under that kind of threat, carrying it alone, made Rick's stomach twist. "And you?" Rick asked softly. "Did Marlon threaten you too?" Lara's lips tightened as she reached again for her sleeve, almost instinctively hiding the bruises. "I tried to leave him," she admitted. "After Hazel's first birthday, I'd saved some money, packed bags, everything. Evan said he'd help us disappear, but Marlon found out." Her voice faltered. Rick leaned in, giving her the patience she hadn't been given anywhere else. "He dragged me back inside the apartment," she continued, voice trembling. "He took my phone, my wallet. He blocked every door. He told me I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Hazel." Rick's fingers curled against the table. He could feel heat rising up his spine, the kind only a father, only a protector could feel. "How did Hazel handle all this?" he asked quietly. Something inside Lara broke. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "She's been living between fear and instability since she was old enough to walk," she said. "She tiptoes around him. She hides in corners when he raises his voice. She sleeps with her shoes on sometimes because she thinks she might have to run." Rick swallowed hard, fighting back the fury clawing its way up his throat. No 3-year-old should ever think about running. "And Evan?" he asked, voice strained. "What did he do when all this started?" "He tried," she whispered. "He really tried. He'd sneak over when Marlon was at work, bring diapers, food, anything we needed. But Marlon always seemed to know. He'd show up out of nowhere, pound on the door, accuse me of things. Evan would hide in the back, terrified Hazel would see something she couldn't forget." Lara wiped her eyes. "Evan finally told me he had to step back. That as long as Marlon was around, Evan's presence only made things worse. And he was right. Every time Evan tried to help, Marlon escalated." Rick felt the truth settle in his bones like iron. Evan hadn't just been afraid. He'd been outmatched. He'd been fighting a man who played dirty, who controlled every corner of Lara's life, who used intimidation like oxygen. And Hazel, sweet, innocent Hazel, had been caught in the crossfire. Rick's voice tightened. "Lara, everything you're telling me, it means the danger is still real." "Yes," she whispered, "very real, and Marlon doesn't let go. He watches, he listens, he follows. That's why you showing up yesterday terrified Evan. He doesn't know what Marlon will do now that you've seen Hazel." Rick felt a cold certainty settle into his chest. This wasn't some messy breakup. This wasn't a family misunderstanding. This was a threat, a living, breathing danger, and it was closer than he ever imagined. Rick pushed back his chair slowly. "Lara, I believe you, and I'm not running from this, not anymore. Whatever Evan faced alone, he's not facing it alone now." For the first time since he entered the cafe, Lara looked at him with something like relief, shaken, fragile but real. Rick stood, his voice calm but steeled. "This ends. One way or another, it ends." But even as he said it, a chill crawled up his spine. Because now he understood. Marlon wasn't just a problem. He was a storm, one already moving dangerously close. Rick didn't storm over to Evan's apartment. He didn't slam his truck door or stomp up the walkway the way rage tempted him to. Instead, he moved with a deliberate calm, a quiet, heavy steadiness he'd learned as a firefighter years ago. When chaos rose, the person who stayed calm controlled the room. And right now, his family needed control, not an explosion. He knocked gently. The door cracked open. Evan peered out like a man expecting a punch. When he saw his father standing there, hands open, shoulders relaxed, his tension didn't vanish, but something in him loosened by a fraction. "Dad," Evan whispered, I didn't think you'd come back." Rick nodded once. "I'm not angry, son." Evan blinked, his eyes glassy and exhausted. "You should be." "Maybe," Rick admitted softly, "but anger's not why I'm here." For a long moment, father and son stood in silence. Then Evan stepped aside. Rick entered slowly, eyes drifting to the small toys scattered across the living room floor, the tiny shoes by the couch, the half-built tower of blocks leaning like it might fall at any second. Evidence of a child's presence. Evidence Evan had fought to hide. Evan swallowed hard. "Dad, before anything else, I need you to know, I never wanted it like this." Rick let him speak. "I wanted you to meet her," Evan continued, voice cracking. "God, I wanted that more than anything, but I couldn't risk it. I couldn't put you in danger. I couldn't let Marlon find out about you." Rick's breath left him in a slow exhale. Hearing his son admit it was one thing, seeing the torment etched into his face was another. "Evan," Rick said gently, "you don't have to protect me from the truth." Evan pressed both hands over his face, his shoulders shuddered. "I was terrified, Dad, every day, every night. Hazel deserved a normal family and I couldn't give her one. Marlon kept pushing, threatening, watching us. He told me if I didn't disappear, he'd kill me. He'd kill anyone helping me." Rick didn't interrupt. He let Evan finally release the words he'd been choking on for years. "I thought if I stepped back, maybe she'd be safe," Evan whispered. "But I lost her, I lost you, I lost everything." Rick moved closer and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "You didn't lose me, and you're not losing her." A small sound interrupted them, a soft shuffle, a curious squeak against the hardwood floor. They both turned. Hazel peeked around the hallway corner, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes, his eyes, widened when she saw Rick. She hesitated only a moment before toddling forward, her little hand reaching out in an unspoken question. Rick knelt slowly. "Hi, Hazel," he said softly. "I'm Rick." She didn't understand all the words, but she understood him. Something in his tone, something safe. She stepped closer and without warning pressed her small body against his chest. Rick froze, then wrapped his arms around her gently, terrified he might break from the emotion rising in him. Evan watched, eyes filling, hand covering his mouth as he fought to keep control. "She likes you," he whispered. Rick shook his head faintly, fighting tears. "She doesn't like me, Evan. She knows me." Hazel stayed clinging to him, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt like she'd been waiting for him her whole life. The moment shattered when Evan's phone buzzed violently on the counter. He glanced at the screen, and his face went white. "It's Marlon." Rick stiffened. The ringing continued, growing sharper, more persistent. Evan hesitated before answering, putting it on speaker by instinct. "What the hell is going on?" Marlon's voice exploded through the room. "Where's Lara? Why isn't she answering me? And why the hell did someone see an old man leaving that cafe yesterday?" Evan's breath caught. Rick felt Hazel flinch against him. I don't know what you're talking about," Evan said, voice trembling. "Don't lie to me," Marlon hissed. "If you idiots are trying something, I swear." Rick reached over and hit end call. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, electric. Evan looked at his father with pure panic in his eyes. Dad, he knows something's happening. Rick shifted Hazel gently in his arms, her small head resting on his shoulder, her trust warming the hollow spaces inside him. He's escalating, Evan whispered. This is bad, this is really bad. Rick met his son's terrified gaze with a calm, iron steadiness. No, he said quietly. This is the moment everything changes. Evan swallowed. Dad, what do we do? Rick stood slowly, Hazel still holding on to him, her soft breath steady against his collar. We do what should have been done a long time ago, Rick said. We protect her, and we don't run anymore. Hazel's hand clutched a little tighter. Rick looked down at her, voice soft but unbreakable. She has me now. Those words settled in the air, warm, protective, and dangerous. Because with that promise, the stakes shifted. And the storm Marlon was building was about to meet something far stronger. The afternoon sunlight was just starting to fade when the knock came, hard, fast, the kind that didn't belong to a neighbor or a delivery driver. Rick felt the vibration run through the apartment floorboards. Evan's head snapped toward the door. Lara, who'd arrived moments earlier shaken and pale, froze where she stood. Hazel, coloring on the rug, flinched at the sound. Rick didn't need to ask who it was. Marlon. The knock came again, this time followed by the unmistakable rattle of someone trying the door handle. Evan moved instinctively, stepping forward, but Rick raised a hand, stopping him. He picked up Hazel gently and placed her behind his legs, his stance widening just enough to shield her completely. Evan's voice trembled. Dad, he can't be here, he can't. He is, Rick murmured quietly. Stay behind me. Another slam hit the door. Then Marlon's voice, low, demanding, edged with an anger that made the air feel thinner. Open the damn door, Evan. Lara's breathing hitched. She backed up until she hit the kitchen counter, gripping it so tightly her knuckles whitened. Evan hesitated only a second before unlocking the door halfway, keeping the chain still latched. It didn't matter. Marlon shoved the door with enough force that Evan stumbled backward, and the chain strained violently. His face filled the doorway, anger twisting his features, eyes darting around the apartment like a predator, searching for something he'd been denied for too long. Where is she? Marlon snarled. Where's Lara? Where's the kid? Lara stepped forward only an inch. Marlon, stop, please don't do this. Oh, I'm doing this, he growled, pushing harder on the door. You think you get to ignore my calls? You think you can run around town meeting up with your old flings and hiding my... She's not yours, Evan shouted, voice cracking. Marlon's eyes snapped toward him, and a sickening smile slid across his face. Look who finally grew a spine. Rick felt his jaw clench. Hazel pressed closer to his leg, tiny fingers gripping his jeans. She didn't cry, she didn't make a sound, but her whole body trembled. Rick stepped forward, making himself a physical barrier between Hazel and the door. When Marlon finally noticed him, the man's expression shifted. Surprise flickered, followed by amusement, followed by something darker. Well, well, Marlon drawled. So this is the old man, the hero Daddy used to brag about. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. You really want to get involved in something you don't understand? Rick's voice was steady. You need to leave. Marlon laughed, a short, sharp sound dripping with contempt. Old man shouldn't pick fights he can't finish. Rick didn't react. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply shifted his stance slightly, placing his body more squarely between Hazel and Marlon. Hazel hid completely behind his leg now, only her small hand gripping the hem of his jacket still visible. Evan tried to pull the door shut farther, but Marlon kept his foot wedged against. Tia, you think this changes anything, Marlon hissed. You think you can hide her from me? I know every move you make. Lara's voice broke. Please, Marlon, Hazel is scared, just leave. Good, he snapped. Maybe fear will keep all of you in line. Rick's hands curled at his sides, but he didn't step forward. Not yet. Hazel needed calm, not chaos. Then somewhere down the hallway, a door slammed. A neighbor shouted something about calling the police. Seconds later, footsteps approached, heavy, purposeful. Detective June Wallace appeared at the end of the corridor, badge visible, posture sharp. "Back away from the door," she ordered. Marlon turned, eyes narrowing. "You again?" "Yes," Wallace said, hand resting on her holster. "And last I checked, a restraining order violation is still a crime." Evan stiffened. "Restraining order." Wallace didn't look away from Marlon. "Filed this morning, by Lara, effective immediately." Marlon's face twisted. "You think a piece of paper scares me?" "It doesn't have to scare you," Wallace replied. "It just has to give me the authority to arrest you if you don't leave." A long, tense moment stretched between them. Marlon's jaw flexed, eyes flicking from Wallace to the partially open door, then to Rick, still standing firm, still shielding Hazel. The smirk returned, uglier this time. "This isn't over," he murmured, "not by a long shot." Then he stepped back, letting the door close slightly. He pointed a finger at Evan. "You're making a mistake." And finally he turned and walked down the hall slowly, deliberately, before disappearing into the stairwell. The apartment fell silent. Evan slammed the deadbolt shut and backed away from the door, chest heaving. Lara collapsed into a chair, hands trembling uncontrollably. Hazel peeked out from behind Rick's leg, her wide eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, safety, certainty. Rick scooped her up gently, feeling her tiny arms wrap around his neck. He held her long enough for her breathing to steady. Wallace approached the doorway. "He'll be back," she warned quietly. "Men like him don't walk away just because they're told to." Rick met her gaze, his voice low but unyielding. "I know." Hazel tucked her face into his shoulder. And Rick understood, this wasn't the confrontation. It was only the warning shot. The apartment was still humming with the aftershock of Marlon's appearance. Even after Detective Wallace left, the walls felt like they were holding a different kind of pressure, fear that had finally been given a face, a voice, a threat. Rick paced the living room once, twice, then stopped in front of Evan. "We can't wait for him to show up again," Rick said, voice steady but edged with urgency. "You need to take legal action." Evan shook his head immediately. "Dad, you don't understand. Marlon has people, friends from his old jobs, guys who look the other way when he steps out of line. He's connected in ways that don't make sense. Court orders won't stop someone like him." Rick stepped closer. "If we do nothing, we're sitting ducks. Hazel is sitting in the middle of a war she didn't choose." His voice lowered. "And I'm not letting her be collateral damage." Evan dropped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "Dad, I'm scared. Every time I've tried to fight back, Marlon hit harder. He knows how to twist things. He knows how to make me look unstable, irresponsible. He knows how to make Lara look like she's losing it." Rick took a quiet breath. "Then we get someone who knows how to fight him." Evan looked up confused. "Who?" "Calvin Brooks," Rick said. "He's been my attorney for years. He handled the settlement when your mother passed. He's good, he's tough, and he knows how to deal with men like Marlon." Rick didn't wait. He stepped into the kitchen, dialed Calvin's number, and explained everything in clipped, controlled detail. The threats, the bruises, Marlon's behavior, Hazel's fear, the confrontation at the apartment. Calvin listened without interruption. When Rick finished, Calvin spoke in the calm, seasoned tone of a man who'd seen a lifetime of battles play out in courtrooms. "You need emergency protection orders," he said. "For Lara, for Hazel, and frankly for Evan. I'll file the paperwork today. And Rick, don't let that man near the child again, not for a second." Rick promised he wouldn't. When he returned to the living room, Evan looked like he was bracing for bad news. Instead, Rick sat beside him. "Calvin will handle it," Rick said. "But we can't do this halfway. We need to gather evidence, keep Hazel safe, and stay ahead of Marlon. Lara, who had been silent near the window, looked up. Her voice was small. I can't go back to my place tonight. He'll be waiting. You're staying here, Rick said instantly. Evan nodded in agreement. Yeah, stay with us, both of you. Hazel will be safer here. Lara hesitated. What if he follows me? What if I make things worse? Rick shook his head. You're not the problem, Lara. He is. And he doesn't get to isolate you anymore. It didn't take long for Lara to gather the little belongings she'd brought. Hazel's small backpack, a few clothes, the worn stuffed rabbit Hazel dragged everywhere. She sat beside her daughter, brushing her fingers gently through Hazel's hair. Hazel looked up at Rick then, her brown-green eyes bright with trust. Papa Rick, she said softly, testing the name like it was something she'd known forever. Rick froze. His throat tightened, the word hitting him with a force he didn't see coming. Evan watched him carefully, guilt and gratitude flickering across his face at once. Lara smiled faintly. She's already attached to you. She feels safe. Rick knelt beside Hazel. I've got you, he whispered. I always will. In that moment, something shifted. Not a simple emotional tug, something deeper. A connection sealed by fear, need, and blood. Rick realized with a clarity that scared him. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything he'd already lost. Later that night, after Hazel fell asleep curled against Lara's side, Rick stepped out onto the apartment balcony. The city buzzed quietly below, oblivious to the storm brewing inside one small Denver home. Evan joined him, rubbing the tension from his forehead. Dad, do you really think we can win this? He asked quietly. Against him. Rick looked at the streetlights stretching into the distance. We don't have a choice. Evan swallowed. He won't go down easily. You saw it today. He's unpredictable, dangerous. Rick turned toward him, eyes steady. That's why we prepare. That's why we get legal protection. That's why we document everything. Evan nodded slowly. You think custody could actually happen? Rick didn't answer immediately. The idea had been forming slowly all evening, taking shape with every frightened glance Hazel gave, every bruise he'd seen on Lara, every tremble in Evan's voice. It might, Rick said finally, and if it comes to that, we fight for her. Evan exhaled shakily. A custody battle with Marlon lurking in the background, Dad, that's a nightmare. Rick placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then we wake up before he drags us deeper. Inside, Hazel shifted and mumbled softly in her sleep. Rick watched her through the glass and felt his resolve harden. Marlon wasn't just a threat to Lara. He wasn't just tormenting Evan. He was circling Hazel. And Rick would burn the world down before he let that happen. The knock on the apartment door came just after sunrise. Not loud, not frantic, just steady enough to feel wrong. Rick opened it expecting a neighbor or Detective Wallace, someone familiar. Instead, a man in a suit stood holding a thick envelope. Are you Evan Dalton? He asked. Rick's stomach dropped. Evan stepped from behind him, eyes already widening. Yes. You've been served. The man handed over the envelope and left before anyone could ask a single question. Evan stared at the papers like they were a bomb counting down in his hands. His fingers trembled as he tore the packet open. Rick watched the color drain from his son's face. Oh God, Evan whispered. He filed a complaint. Lara froze across the room, Hazel perched on her lap. What kind of complaint? Evan swallowed hard. Marlon is claiming you kidnapped Hazel. Lara gasped, hand to her chest, her eyes filling instantly. He can't say that. She's my daughter. Rick took the papers from Evan and scanned them quickly. Legal jargon, emergency relief request, custody accusations twisted into a weapon, Marlon's signature scrawled like a slash across the bottom. The accusation was designed for maximum damage. Rick set the papers on the table with a hard thud. He's trying to flip the narrative. He wants to paint us as the unstable ones. Evan ran a shaking hand through his hair. Dad, if the court believes this, if they think we're hiding Hazel. Rick cut in, voice sharp. We're not going to let that happen. He called attorney Calvin Brooks immediately. Calvin's voice remained steady even as Rick relayed every detail. Marlon's move is predictable, Calvin said. It's designed to force Lara into a defensive position, but it won't hold if we counter it correctly. I'll prepare a response and evidence packet. We'll show the court exactly who he is. Evidence? Evan echoed anxiously. Everything we have, Rick said. The threats, the bruises, the break-in, Lara's statement, Detective Wallace's report, all of it. But even with a plan forming, fear tangled itself inside the apartment like a thick fog. The hearing was set for 2 days later. Those 48 hours felt like each second ran along a frayed edge. Lara barely slept. Evan paced until Rick forced him to sit. Hazel sensed the tension but didn't understand it. She clung to Rick's leg endlessly, seeking quiet reassurance. And Rick, well, he hadn't felt this tightly wound since he was running into burning buildings. The courthouse hallway smelled of old varnish and nerves. People whispered. Shoes clicked against marble. Documents shuffled. Rick sat on the bench with Hazel on his lap. Her tiny hands gripped the collar of his jacket, her head tucked under his chin as if the world outside him didn't exist. "You okay, sweetheart?" Rick whispered. She nodded, but her small body stayed tense. Evan and Lara stood a few steps away with Calvin, going over the game plan for the 10th time. Rick watched them, both trying to stay upright under the weight of fear. Then Marlon arrived. He walked down the hallway in a neatly pressed shirt, hair slicked back, wearing a calm smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a respectable citizen, a concerned partner, a victim. It made Rick's skin crawl. Lara shrank back instinctively. Evan's breath hitched. Hazel clutched Rick tighter, sensing something wrong without understanding why. Marlon's eyes flicked toward Rick, then to Hazel, then back to Rick again. He nodded as if greeting an acquaintance at a grocery store. "Morning," he said lightly. Rick didn't respond. He held Hazel tighter. Calvin stepped in front of Marlon before anyone else could react. "Mr. Tate will speak in the courtroom, not here." Marlon smirked like the entire situation amused him. "Of course, counselor." If Rick had any doubt about Marlon's manipulative skill, it vanished in the courtroom. When the hearing began, Marlon spoke with calm precision. Polite voice, careful phrasing, a picture of fatherly concern. He claimed Lara had become unstable. He claimed Evan was emotionally volatile. He claimed Hazel had been taken without his knowledge. He never raised his voice, never sounded angry, never let the mask slip. Rick watched the judge absorb every word with a neutral expression that revealed nothing. Calvin countered expertly. He presented photos of Lara's injuries, statements from Detective Wallace, reports of Marlon's volatile behavior. He pointed to inconsistencies in Marlon's timeline, contradictions in his statements, and the suspicious timing of his complaint. But Marlon stayed composed, too composed. He sat with his hands folded like a man, confident. The system was already leaning his way. And Rick felt it, a quiet, unsettling chill. Something was off. When the hearing wrapped, the judge leaned forward slightly. "Given the conflicting claims," she said, "I'm ordering an emergency investigation into the child's environment." Lara's hand flew to her mouth. Evan went pale. Marlon simply nodded, like he'd expected it. The judge continued, "Until the investigation concludes, custody will remain unchanged. All parties are required to cooperate fully." Then her gaze landed briefly on Rick holding Hazel in the hallway. Something flickered there, recognition of the bond, perhaps, but the moment passed quickly. Court adjourned. Outside in the hallway, Evan sagged against the wall. "Dad, this could go either way. What if the judge believes him?" Rick didn't answer right away. He watched Marlon walking out of the courthouse with a slow, measured confidence. A confidence that came from something hidden. Something he hadn't revealed yet. Rick's jaw tightened. "We're missing something," he murmured. "He knows something we don't." Hazel pressed her cheek against his shoulder. And Rick felt the storm shifting again. Closer, darker, far more dangerous than before. Detective June Wallace didn't call first. She showed up at Evan's apartment 24 hours after the court hearing, her knock sharp, urgent, nothing like the calm professionalism she normally carried. Rick opened the door and immediately saw it. Her expression wasn't just serious. It was locked in a grim urgency that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Rick," she said, stepping inside, "I need everyone in the living room, now." Evan came out of the hallway rubbing his eyes. Lara stood from the couch, clutching Hazel clothes. The atmosphere changed instantly, as if the room itself sensed the threat approaching. Wallace didn't sit. She didn't soften her tone. "I ran a deep trace on Marlon Tate." Evan stiffened. Lara's hands tightened around Hazel. Rick's voice was low, and "He's not Marlon Tate," Wallace said. "Not legally, not on any verifiable record." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean he's not Marlon?" Lara whispered. "I mean the identity he's been using is fabricated," Wallace said. "Every document tied to him, employment, rental agreements, even his ID, are built off a false background." Lara blinked rapidly, her mouth opening in disbelief. He showed me everything. His driver's license, his tax papers, everything." "Fake," Wallace said gently, "all of it." Rick felt something cold crawl beneath his skin. So who is he really? Wallace took out a file from her bag, thick and heavily marked. "His real name is Marshall Totham, and he has a record spanning 3 states. She opened the file on the coffee table. The first page was a mugshot. Marlon, younger, hair shorter, eyes colder. Lara stared at it for barely a second before her knees buckled. Rick lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. Hazel whimpered at the sudden movement, clinging to her mother's shirt. "It's okay," Rick whispered to Lara, steadying her. "You're okay." But she was. None of them were. Wallace went on. "His record includes domestic violence, 2 cases dismissed without explanation, extortion, intimidation, and," she hesitated a split second, "prior kidnapping charges." Lara gasped, both hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, oh my God." Hazel reached up and touched her mother's cheek, confused and frightened. Rick felt something deep inside him harden, something primal, protective. "Kidnapping who?" "A former girlfriend's child," Wallace said. "He claimed he was trying to rescue the child from her. The charges were dropped when the woman disappeared out of state, but based on the file, she wasn't hiding from the court." Evan's hands shook. "She was hiding from him." Wallace nodded. "Most likely, yes." Lara collapsed into the nearest chair, trembling uncontrollably. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. He told me he had a rough past. He said people lied about him, he said." "Abusers always say that," Wallace said gently. "You believed him because you're kind, and he took advantage of that." Evan's voice cracked as he stepped forward. "Detective, I tried to tell someone years ago." His shoulders slumped under the weight of the memory. "When Hazel was a newborn, he was already threatening us. I went to a lawyer, then the police, but Marlon cornered me. He said if I tried to expose him again, he'd erase me." Wallace frowned deeply. "Why didn't you report that?" "Because he proved he could get to us," Evan whispered. "He showed me pictures he'd taken of you, Dad, walking home from the grocery store. Pictures of Lara and Hazel in the park. He knew where we lived. He knew everything." Rick felt the room go silent around him. The world shrank to a pinprick of cold fury. Wallace cleared her throat, regaining their attention. We have enough probable cause now. I've just gotten approval for a warrant. Full search, full arrest. We're picking him up tonight." Lara exhaled shakily, like a small piece of hope had cracked open inside her. Evan wrapped an arm around her, Hazel tucked between them. But Rick didn't move. He didn't feel relief. A man like Marshall, didn't run when cornered. He struck. "Detective," Rick said slowly, "have you told anyone else about the warrant?" "Just my partner," Wallace replied. "Why?" "Because if he finds out," Rick said, voice tightening, "he won't wait to be arrested." As if on cue, Wallace's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, and her face went pale. "What?" Evan demanded. "What is it?" Wallace swallowed. "He's gone." Lara's breath caught. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "He wasn't at his apartment," Wallace said. "His belongings are missing. Neighbors say they saw him leaving in a hurry last night," and her jaw clenched. "We found a burner phone smashed behind the building." Rick felt the dread settle like a stone in his stomach. "He knows," he said quietly. "He knows you were coming." Wallace didn't deny it. Evan stepped forward. "Detective, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for Hazel?" Wallace turned toward the little girl, now perched in Rick's arms, her eyes wide, her fingers curled into his shirt. "It means," she said grimly, "he's unpredictable now. Desperate men with records like his don't run empty-handed." Rick's heart pounded once in his chest, heavy and cold. "He's not running," Rick murmured, realization hitting him all at once. Wallace looked up sharply. "Rick." "He's circling," Rick said. "He's shifting. And now that the walls are closing in," Rick tightened his grip around Hazel, "she's the only piece he can still use." The room went silent. Not a peaceful silence. A warning. Hazel rested her head against Rick's shoulder, unaware of the darkness gathering outside the walls meant to protect her. And Rick understood, with absolute clarity. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here. The morning after Detective Wallace confirmed Marlon had vanished, Rick insisted they all stick to a strict routine. Doors locked, blinds down, no one outside alone, not even for a minute. Evan agreed. Lara agreed. But Hazel, 3 years old, restless and tightly wounded from days of tension, needed fresh air, needed space, needed a moment where the world didn't feel like it was pressing down on her tiny shoulders. So they let her play in the backyard of Evan's apartment building, a fenced area with a small patch of grass and a shed tucked in the corner. Evan stood by the sliding door, watching her. Rick stood near the kitchen, keeping a line of sight through the glass. Lara was on the couch, hands clasped anxiously, watching every move Hazel made. For a few minutes, it felt almost normal. Hazel chased a blue rubber ball across the yard, giggling softly to herself. She hummed some little tune she'd made up, something light, fragile, like a piece of innocence returning. Then in a blink she was gone. Evan leaned closer to the glass. "Dad, do you see her?" Rick stepped forward. The ball rolled gently across the yard, but Hazel wasn't anywhere in sight. "Hazel," Evan called through the open crack of the door. "Sweetheart." No answer. Rick's stomach dropped. "Evan, get out there." Evan was already running. He kicked the door open and sprinted across the small patch of grass, calling her name louder and louder with each passing second. "Hazel, Hazel." Lara lurched to her feet. "Where is she? Evan, where is she?" Rick bolted outside too, heart pounding with a cold, hard rhythm. The yard wasn't large. There were only a few places she could be, but she wasn't near the bushes. She wasn't by the small tree. She wasn't by the fence. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Then a minute. Panic rose like fire. "Hazel," Rick shouted, voice cracking. "Answer me." Evan circled the yard again, frantic. "Dad, Dad, she's not here, she's not." Rick grabbed his arm. "She didn't climb the fence. She's too small. She wouldn't have made it to the gate without us seeing. Check the shed." Evan darted toward the faded wooden structure in the corner. He pulled on the old handle, it stuck. He yanked again, harder. The door creaked open. Inside in the shadows, something moved. "Hazel," Evan whispered. A tiny whimper answered him. He dropped to his knees, reaching into the dark. Hazel crawled out slowly, trembling so hard she could barely hold herself upright. Her little hands clutched her stuffed rabbit, her face pale, her lips quivering. "Sweetheart, oh God, Hazel," Evan breathed, pulling her into his arms. "Why were you hiding? Why didn't you answer us? We were scared." Hazel pressed her face into his shoulder and whispered something so soft it was barely sound. Evan pulled back slightly. "What, baby? Say it again." Her voice trembled. "A man called my name." The world tilted. Lara let out a sharp, broken sob as she ran across the yard. Rick felt a bolt of fury spike through him, hot, violent, immediate. He scanned the fence, the alley, the neighboring yards, every shadow, every corner. Nothing. No movement, no sign of intrusion. But Hazel's shaking told him everything he needed to know. Someone had been there. Someone had said her name. And Hazel had done the only thing she could, hidden. Rick knelt in front of her as Evan held her tightly. "Hazel," he said gently, "can you tell me what the man sounded like?" She didn't look up, she only whispered. He said, "Hazel, come here." Her small shoulders shivered. "I got scared." Rick closed his eyes. Not in fear, fear had long passed. What rose in its place was fury. Pure, sharp, controlled fury. The kind he hadn't felt since losing his wife. The kind that made every instinct in him sharpen to a point. He stood and took out his phone. "Wallace," he said when she answered, not bothering with a greeting. "He's here, or he was here." Hazel heard a man call her name. Wallace swore under her breath. "I'll have patrols rotating your block within 5 minutes. Stay inside. Lock every entry point. We'll canvass the area." Rick hung up and turned back to the others. Lara was holding Hazel now, rocking her in a tight embrace. Evan sat beside them, shaking from the inside out. Rick crouched down, speaking gently. "I'm taking her home with me today." Evan blinked, startled. "Dad, what? Why?" Rick's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The steel in it was enough. "Your apartment is too exposed, too predictable, too easy to watch. My place is secluded, fenced, alarmed, and no one knows she's there." Lara nodded immediately. "Yes, yes, please. She'll be safer with Rick. She trusts him." Hazel lifted her head and reached toward Rick, her little arms open. That was the answer. Rick held her close, resting her head on his shoulder. She burrowed into him, breathing shakily, trying to calm her tiny, trembling body. Evan's eyes filled, not with shame this time, but with gratitude so deep it nearly crushed him. "Dad," he whispered, "thank you for stepping up, for not letting her slip away." Rick tightened his hold on Hazel. "She's not slipping anywhere," he said softly. But inside he felt a new certainty, one colder and sharper than fear. Marlon wasn't done. And now, Hazel wasn't just in danger. She was being hunted. Rick didn't waste a single hour after bringing Hazel home. The moment he stepped inside his quiet Denver house, the same home where he'd raised Evan, where framed memories lined the hallways, he felt the old protector in him rise with renewed purpose. This was no longer just a safe haven. It needed to be a fortress. He set Hazel down gently on the couch with her stuffed rabbit and moved through the house with intention. First the doors, reinforced locks, added deadbolts, security bars for the back entry. Then the windows, every latch checked twice, blinds pulled down, motion detectors repositioned. He climbed onto a step stool to mount new cameras under the eaves, each angled to eliminate blind spots. Hazel watched him work with wide, curious eyes, not fully understanding the danger, but sensing that Rick was building something meant to protect her. When he smiled at her, her shoulders eased, her little body relaxing back into the cushions. By nightfall, A new security system was humming through the house, and Rick's laptop displayed a grid of camera feeds covering every inch of his property. But protection alone wasn't enough. If they were going to survive the coming storm, they needed evidence, cold, concrete proof of Marlon's harassment, threats, and dangerous behavior. So Rick opened a fresh notebook, titled the first page Marlon Tatum Incidents, and began documenting every detail he could recall. Dates, times, conversations, the break-in at Evan's apartment, the screaming in the hallway, Hazel hiding in the shed, the police reports, Wallace's warnings, even the way Hazel trembled when she heard a knock. Every detail mattered now. Evan arrived later that evening, eyes exhausted but determined. Rick sat him down at the kitchen table. "We're going into a custody fight," he said plainly. "Marlon's going to twist everything he can. We need to stay ahead." Evan nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Dad. Every time I push back, Marlon finds a way to hit harder." Rick placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's why you're not pushing alone this time." He talked Evan through the steps, document every call, every message, every strange car he noticed. Keep a written log, save screenshots, stay coordinated with Calvin Brooks. Preparation was their armor now. Evan listened, absorbing each instruction like a man finally seeing a way out of a burning building. A little while later, Lara arrived. She looked smaller than usual, like fear had carved her edges thinner. She sat on the edge of Rick's couch, twisting her hands in her lap until her knuckles turned white. "Rick," she whispered, "I need to tell you something I haven't said aloud before." He sat beside her, giving her space but staying present. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears gathering. "Not just of Marlon, but of losing Hazel. He keeps twisting everything. He makes people be. Leave him. I'm afraid that one day, one wrong move, and she'll be gone, just gone." Her voice cracked. She covered her face. Rick spoke quietly, firmly. "You're not losing her, not while I'm breathing." She looked at him through her tears, shaken by the certainty in his voice. "Stay here," Rick continued. "Both of you, as long as you need. My home is safe. My neighborhood is quiet. And Hazel, she's calmer here, you saw that." Lara nodded slowly, as though the offer itself provided a kind of stability she hadn't felt in years. That night, after everyone settled in guest rooms and living spaces, Rick tucked Hazel into the small bedroom that used to be Evan's. He found one of his old flannel shirts and draped it over her like a blanket. She curled into it instinctively, holding her stuffed rabbit close. Rick sat in the doorway, watching her eyelids flutter closed. Her breathing softened into the slow, deep rhythm of real sleep, the kind she hadn't had in far too long. For the first time since he discovered her existence, Hazel slept peacefully. Rick exhaled, a long, quiet breath that seemed to release a decade's worth of grief and helplessness. He didn't feel old tonight, didn't feel worn or lonely. He felt sharp, present, necessary. He felt purpose again. As he stood and closed her door halfway, careful not to wake her, one truth anchored him more deeply than anything the past weeks had brought. He wasn't just protecting Hazel. He was fighting for her future. And the real battle was only beginning. Rick was pouring Hazel a cup of warm milk when his phone buzzed violently on the counter. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a call. It was the emergency alert tone Detective Wallace had set up for him earlier that week. He snatched the phone. "WLAC, Rick, it's Evan's building. Marlon broke in." Rick froze. "Is Evan okay? Is anyone hurt?" "He wasn't there when it happened," Wallace replied. "Neighbors called 911 after hearing someone tearing through the apartment. He was shouting Hazel's name, screaming it." Rick's breath stopped in his chest. Hazel, half asleep at the table, looked up at him with trusting eyes. He forced a steady expression onto his face, terrified she'd sense even a fraction of the truth. "When did this happen?" Rick asked. 10 minutes ago. Patrol units got there fast, but he slipped out the back stairwell before they arrived. Wallace's voice hardened. This wasn't random. He was looking for her, Rick. Rick's stomach tightened. He thinks she's still living there. Not anymore, Wallace said. Now he knows she's not, and that puts you in his path. Rick gripped the phone tighter. Detective, what are you saying? I'm saying you're on his list now. The line went quiet. Rick knew she wasn't trying to scare him. She was preparing him. And deep down, he'd already felt the shift. Marlon was done playing with shadows. He was making moves. Big ones. The messages started 2 hours later. Evan had come to Rick's house, shaken, apologizing over and over as if he'd personally opened the door for Marlon. Lara followed shortly after, pale and trembling. They all gathered in Rick's living room, the windows locked, curtains drawn tight. Rick's phone vibrated again. A text. From a blocked number. He opened it. You think you can hide her forever. Rick exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. He didn't respond. Another buzz. Old man, hero, do you really think you can keep what isn't yours? Evan saw the messages over Rick's shoulder and nearly collapsed. Dad, he knows where we are, he knows, Rick grabbed his son's shoulders, steadying him. Listen to me. He wants a reaction, he wants panic. We don't give it to him. But inside, Rick felt the slow burn of fury ignite. Hazel wasn't an object. She wasn't leverage. She wasn't a prize. She was a child. Rick had fought fires that took entire houses. He'd fought grief when he lost his wife. But this, the threat of losing Hazel, was a different kind of heat. One he refused to let consume them. Another buzz. This time a photo. A picture of Rick's truck parked in his driveway. Lara saw it and broke instantly, her breath ripping out of her lungs. She slid to the floor, hands shaking so violently she couldn't control them. He's here, she cried. Rick, he's here, he's watching, he's going to take her, he's going to take my baby. Rick knelt beside her. Lara, look at me. She couldn't. Her body collapsed in on itself. Pure panic. The panic of a mother who had lived under violence for too long and finally understood just how far that violence could reach. Rick placed a steady hand on her back. He's not taking her, not while she's breathing, not while I am. Evan crouched beside them, tears streaking his face. I can't do this. Dad, I can't protect her. I can't protect anyone. Every time I try, it gets worse. Rick grabbed his son's face gently, forcing him to meet his eyes. Evan, listen. You've done everything you could with what you had. This isn't happening because you failed. It's happening because a dangerous man refuses to let go. But we are not breaking. Not now. Evan's chest heaved. Dad, how are you so calm? I'm not, Rick admitted, but she needs me to be. Hazel, confused by the tension, toddled over and climbed into Rick's lap. She curled against him, her tiny hand resting on his chest. He wrapped an arm around her instinctively, her presence grounding him. She whispered, Papa Rick, don't let the bad man come. It nearly broke him. I won't, Rick whispered into her hair. I promise. Detective Wallace arrived minutes later, footsteps sharp in the hallway. Rick opened the door before she could knock. We've traced the messages, she said. All coming from burner phones. He's being careful, too careful. Meaning, Rick asked. Meaning he's planning something, Wallace said, her voice grim. He's escalating because he feels control slipping. This break-in, these messages, this is his last gamble before he does something reckless. Rick felt Hazel's small hand clutch his shirt again. Wallace lowered her voice. Rick, don't let her out of your sight, not for a second. Rick nodded once. Inside the house, Lara was shaking. Evan was unraveling, and fear hung heavy in the air. Rick stepped into the center of the room, Hazel still in his arms, and spoke with a quiet strength neither panic nor violence could touch. Listen to me, we're going to get through this, together. I'm not letting this family fall apart. Not now, not ever. They looked at him, broken, desperate, terrified, and in that moment Rick knew exactly who he needed to be. Not just a father, not just a grandfather. The anchor, the one thing Marlon couldn't shake, the one thing that wouldn't bend. And as the night settled in, thick with danger, Rick held Hazel a little closer, knowing the real fight hadn't even begun. Detective Wallace arrived before sunrise, her unmarked SUV rolling into Rick's driveway with the headlights off. She stepped out with a binder tucked under her arm and a look Rick hadn't seen on her before, focused, sharp, ready for confrontation. "Rick," she said quietly, "we're done waiting for him to make the next move. It's time we make one." Rick nodded, Hazel still asleep in the house. "Tell me what you need." Wallace opened the binder, flipping to a page titled Sting Operation, Controlled Environment. "We set a trap," she explained. "Controlled, supervised, covered from every angle. Marlon wants Hazel. He's proven he's watching the places you go, so we use that." Rick didn't hesitate. "What do we do?" "We use a decoy stroller," Wallace said. "Not Hazel, never Hazel. A weighted blanket, a doll, and a coat. Something that looks real from afar. We take it somewhere predictable, somewhere he will expect you." Rick understood instantly. The park near Evan's apartment. Wallace nodded. "He's been circling that area for days. If he thinks you've let your guard down, he'll show himself." Rick exhaled, jaw tight, and then, "We move in fast before he can react." She closed the binder. "But Rick, this only works if he believes the child is with you. You'd have to be visible." Rick didn't flinch. "If it ends this, I'll do it." By mid-morning, the plan was in motion. Officers disguised as joggers spread themselves around the park perimeter. Two sat pretending to read newspapers on opposite benches. A patrol car idled a block away, unseen behind a row of trees. Drones hovered high above, small enough to blend with the sky. Rick arrived with the stroller, pushing it slowly along the paved walkway. His shoulders were relaxed, posture natural, exactly as Wallace instructed. But inside, every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He glanced at the stroller. The decoy doll was wrapped in Hazel's spare coat. From a distance, it looked real, vulnerable. "Bait." Wallace walked beside him, pretending to scroll through her phone, though her eyes scanned every movement, every shadow. "Remember," she whispered, "if he appears, don't confront him. Don't talk to him. Just step back and keep the stroller protected." Rick nodded. "I understand." But his pulse pounded with something deeper than fear, resolve. If Marlon intended to take Hazel, he would have to walk through Rick first. They circled the park once, twice. On the third pass, Wallace subtly touched her earpiece. "Movement on the north path," she murmured. "Unidentified male coming fast." Rick's breath steadied. He kept walking. A figure emerged from between the trees. Heavy steps, frantic energy, eyes darting wildly as he scanned the surroundings. Marlon. Disheveled, sweating, sleeves rolled up, jacket half-zipped. And worse, his right hand tucked behind his hip, hidden, too still to be casual. "Rick," Wallace whispered, voice sharpening, "he's armed." Marlon saw the stroller and froze. Rick felt the shift instantly. The way Marlon's posture straightened, the twitch in his jaw, the hunger in his eyes. A twisted blend of delusion and desperation. "There you are," Marlon muttered under his breath. He moved forward, quick and reckless. Wallace didn't wait. "Units move in." Officers surged from every direct. Iron cutting across the park with practiced precision. Marlon spun, caught off guard, hand snapping outward to reveal a pistol, unsteady, shaking but still dangerous. "Drop the weapon," Wallace ordered, gun drawn. Marlon didn't drop it. Instead, he ran. He bolted toward the tree line, sprinting with the wild, disjointed momentum of a cornered animal. Police chased him, shouting commands that dissolved into the wind. Leaves kicked up behind him as he dodged a bench, stumbled around a trash can, and pushed into the wooded path at full speed. Rick didn't think. He chased. He heard Wallace shout behind him, "Rick, stop! Let us handle it!" But adrenaline drowned out everything. He followed the sound of Marlon's crashing footsteps, weaving through branches, breath burning in his lungs. Marlon looked over his shoulder, saw Rick gaining and pushed harder. Too hard. His foot snagged on a root, sending him skidding down a small incline. He hit the dirt hard. A sick crack echoed through the trees, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. He cried out, clutching his knee. Rick slowed but didn't step closer. He stood 5 feet away, chest heaving, eyes locked on the man who'd tormented his family for years. Marlon glared up at him, hatred burning through the pain. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think I'm done?" Before Rick could reply, officers reached them, guns trained, voices commanding. "Hands behind your head." Marlon tried to stand, but his injured leg buckled. Wallace arrived moments later, cuffs already in hand. "This time," she said, voice cold and controlled, "you are done." She snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Rick felt the tension drain slowly, replaced not with relief, but with the heavy weight of the truth. This wasn't victory. Not yet. Marlon had acted with the desperation of a man who had no more cards to play. And desperate men left chaos behind. Wallace rose, nodding to Rick. "He's in custody, but stay alert. His arrest doesn't undo the damage he's already caused." Rick looked back toward the park, toward the stroller waiting under the sunlight, the decoy coat still wrapped around the false child. Hazel was safe. But Rick felt something cold settle in his chest. The storm wasn't over. Just redirected. The courthouse conference room was quiet enough to hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Rick sat at the head of the table, Hazel in his lap drawing small circles on his shirt with her finger. Evan paced the length of the room, wearing a hole into the carpet. Lara sat between them, hands clenched together, her foot shaking uncontrollably. Detective Wallace entered with attorney Calvin Brooks at her side. Both carried thick files, too thick to mean anything simple. Calvin shut the door behind them. Rick instantly felt the shift in the air. "Sit," Calvin said, his voice steady but sharper than usual. Evan did. Lara didn't move at first, frozen in dread. Rick nudged a chair out for her. Wallace opened the file on the table. "We ran a full search of Marlon Totem's devices after his arrest," she said. "And what we found," she paused, locking eyes with each of them, "it changes everything." Rick felt Hazel lean against him, her small weight a reminder of everything at stake. Calvin slid several papers toward Evan and Lara. "You need to see this." Evan's hands trembled as he lifted the first page, official-looking documents stamped with foreign seals, signatures, and case numbers. His jaw dropped. What is this?" he stammered. Lara reached for a page of her own. The second she read the heading, her face drained of all color. "Petition for full custody, filed under Marlon's name," she whispered. Calvin nodded grimly. He forged everything: birth certificates, medical records, financial statements, even notarized letters. He built an entire fictional history suggesting you, he looked at Lara, were unfit, unstable, and attempting to flee with Hazel. Lara's throat closed. No, 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 no. But Calvin wasn't done. He slid another sheet forward, an airline confirmation. "And this," he said, tapping the page, "is a round-trip ticket to Belize purchased under his real name. Departure date 3 days from now. 1 adult seat, 1 child seat." Lara stared at the document like it might swallow her whole. Then she screamed. A raw, broken scream that tore out of her chest before she could stop it. He was going to take her. He was going to take her. He was going to steal my baby. Hazel flinched at the sound and buried her face in Rick's shoulder. Rick wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, steadying her shaking tiny body. Lara dropped the papers, covering her mouth as her sobs filled the room. Evan stood but couldn't move farther than that. His knees buckled, and he braced himself against the table, breath crashing out of him. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Dad, he was going to take her out of the country. I almost lost her." His voice cracked. "We almost lost her." Rick didn't speak. "Not ye. T." He just held Hazel tighter, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. The gravity of the moment washed over him. If they hadn't caught Marlon, if they hadn't set the trap, Hazel would have been gone. Taken. Disappeared into a country with no extradition guarantees. No trail, no hope. He shut his eyes, breathing in slow, controlled steadiness. It didn't calm him, it anchored him. Calvin continued, voice low. He was going to claim you two abandoned Hazel. He planned to present himself as the only stable guardian, and then vanish off U.S. soil before the court could respond. Wallace added, he'd done it before with another child. This was the same pattern, the same preparation. Evan covered his face. Lara sobbed into her hands. Even Calvin exhaled heavily, as though the sheer evil of Marlon's plan weighed on him. Rick opened his eyes at last. "It's over," he said quietly, but his voice carried an iron edge. "He will never get near her again." Before anyone could respond, a bailiff poked his head into the room. "The judge is ready to see you." The courtroom felt different this time, less uncertain, less fragile. The judge reviewed the evidence Calvin submitted, her expression shifting from disbelief to disgust to something harder, a kind of judicial fury. "These forgeries are extensive," she said. "Premeditated, malicious, and unquestionably designed to remove the child from her mother and her rightful family." Lara squeezed Evan's hand, tears streaking her face. The judge's gaze drifted toward Rick. "And Mr. Dalton, it appears your actions, including documenting incidents and cooperating with authorities, prevented a kidnapping." Rick didn't respond. He wasn't used to praise, he didn't want it. He only wanted Hazel safe. The judge continued, her tone softening. "The court recognizes your involvement as instrumental in safeguarding this child. Your presence has been stabilizing during extreme circumstances." Hazel sat beside him, coloring quietly, unaware the room was deciding her future. The judge took a long breath. "Effective immediately, Hazel Bennett is to remain under the care and oversight of her mother, Lara Bennett, with Evan Dalton receiving co-parenting rights pending further evaluation." Evan exhaled in relief. Lara covered her heart, whispering, "Thank you, thank you." "But one more thing," the judge added. Everyone looked up. In light of the evidence and the emotional bond demonstrated, the court acknowledges Rick Dalton as a consistent, protective, and positive figure in the child's life. He is to be recognized formally as an approved guardian figure during shared custody periods and emergencies. Lara burst into tears again, but this time relief shaped them. Evan placed a hand on Rick's shoulder. "Dad, she's safe because of you." Rick looked at Hazel, her tiny hand gripping a crayon, drawing something that looked like a house, his house. In that moment, the truth settled over him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Hazel wasn't just a grandchild he hadn't known existed. She was family. His to protect. His to guide. His to love. And her future, her safety, her stability, her joy, belonged with the people who had fought hardest for her. With him. With Evan. With Lara. With Rick's family. He bowed his head slightly, overwhelmed by both the weight of what almost happened and the grace of what didn't. The courthouse halls felt different now, quieter, like the storm that had rattled every bone in Rick's body was finally beginning to ease. Still, a heaviness lingered in the air as they waited outside the courtroom for the final custody ruling. Lara sat with her hands intertwined so tightly her fingers blanched. Evan paced in slow circles like he didn't know what to do with his hands, his feet, or his fear. Hazel sat in Rick's lap humming softly, drawing uneven shapes in a small notebook. Rick kept his arm around her, absorbing the moment. Her tiny body felt so light against him, yet somehow she carried the weight of months of pain, fear, and chaos they were all desperate to put behind them. When the courtroom doors finally opened, the bailiff called their names. Rick stood first, Hazel still cuddled against him. For once, Lara and Evan didn't hesitate. They followed his lead, drawing strength just from knowing he was there. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the final reports, flipping through pages with a slow, deliberate pace. No one breathed. No one moved. Even Hazel sensed the tension and rested her head against Rick's chest. Finally, the judge looked up. Having reviewed the full investigative findings, the forensic evaluations, and the documented evidence, the court concludes the custody dispute. Lara's hands trembled violently. The judge continued, effective immediately, full legal and physical custody of Hazel Bennett is returned to her mother, Lara Bennett. Lara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears poured instantly down her cheeks, relief so overwhelming it nearly lifted her from her seat. Evan closed his eyes, absorbing the words like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she said, turning to Evan, the court acknowledges Evan Dalton as an engaged, willing, and capable father. In accordance with the recommendations from child services and psychological evaluators, Mr. Dalton is granted structured co-parenting rights, with transitions monitored as necessary during the initial period. Evan nodded quickly, his voice cracking. Yes, Your Honor, thank you. You've demonstrated commitment to Hazel's safety, the judge added. Your cooperation with law enforcement was noted. Continue building stability, Mr. Dalton. Evan swallowed hard, his eyes brimming. Rick felt Hazel shift in his arms. Her eyes looked between her parents, confused but happy, sensing something good had happened. Then came the part no one expected. And regarding Rick Dalton, the judge said, her voice softening, this court acknowledges his unique role in the child's well-being. Rick stiffened slightly. His consistent involvement, protective actions, and emotional support have proven essential during a period of significant trauma. As such, the court officially recognizes Rick Dalton as an approved guardian figure, permitted to supervise co-parenting transitions, and act as an emergency caregiver when required. Lara wiped her cheeks. Thank you, thank you. Evan touched Rick's shoulder gently, whispering, Dad, she's safe because of you. Rick didn't answer. He only looked down at Hazel, her little fingers now playing with the collar of his jacket. He couldn't help the warmth that swelled inside him. Gratitude maybe, or something deeper. A sense of having been placed exactly where he was needed. Then Calvin Brooks approached, nodding. And with Marlon's charges confirmed, domestic violence, identity fraud, kidnapping conspiracy, forgery, and resisting arrest, his bail has been officially denied. Rick felt tension leave his body like a long exhale. So he's done. Calvin nodded. He won't be out anytime soon, and even if he were, he's now barred from ever coming within 500 yards of Hazel, Lara, Evan. He paused. And you, Rick. Rick didn't smile. He didn't feel triumph, just a steady, settled relief. For the first time in months, they weren't waiting for footsteps in the hallway, for shadows at the window, for threats that felt like they could shatter everything. They were safe. Later that afternoon, they returned to Rick's home. No urgency, no fear, just quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Hazel ran down the hallway on her little legs, calling out, Papa Rick, come see. Rick followed her to the room he'd started preparing days earlier, though he hadn't told anyone. Hazel pushed open the door with both hands. Soft yellow walls, a small white bed with floral sheets, shelves with children's books, A nightlight shaped like a tiny mountain. In one corner, a rocking chair. On the wall above the bed, a framed picture of Hazel he'd printed from Lara's social media, the one where she had his exact smile. Hazel gasped, "It's for me." Rick nodded, "It's yours." She ran to the bed, jumping onto it with a squeal, hugging her stuffed rabbit with all the energy of a child whose world finally felt safe enough to expand again. Lara stood in the doorway, hand pressed to her heart, tears forming again, but these were soft tears, warm tears. Evan stepped beside her, whispering, "Dad made her a whole room." Lara smiled, "She's home here." Evan's voice broke, "So am I." Rick swallowed a lump in his throat. "She should have a place here, always." Hazel climbed off the bed and ran to him, arms spread wide. "Papa Rick, I stay here lots, okay?" Rick scooped her up, lifting her with ease, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "You stay here whenever you want," he said softly. "This is your home, too." Behind him, Lara exhaled, her shoulders finally dropping. Evan sat in the rocking chair, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. Peace, real peace, began settling into the room like a long-awaited warmth. Rick felt it wrap around him, Hazel's little arms around his neck, the weight of months of fear finally lifting. For the first time, the war felt truly over. And the healing had finally begun. The days after the custody ruling settled into a quiet rhythm, something gentle, something healing. Rick hadn't felt this kind of calm in years. His home, once too silent after his wife's passing, now buzzed with the soft sounds of Hazel's laughter, the shuffle of tiny feet down the hallway, and the murmured conversations between Evan and Lara as they tried to rebuild what had nearly been destroyed. One evening, as Hazel napped on the couch wrapped in a small blanket, Evan approached Rick outside on the porch. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the smell of pine from the neighboring yards. Evan stood with one hand gripping the railing, shoulders drawn tight like he was preparing for impact. "Dad," he began softly, "I need to say something, something I should have said months ago." Rick leaned against the porch post, not rushing him. "I'm listening." Evan swallowed, his voice fragile. "I'm sorry for hiding Hazel from you, for shutting you out, for making you feel like you didn't have a place in her life." Rick didn't interrupt. "I told myself I was protecting you," Evan continued, "and maybe that was true at first, but it turned into shame. I felt like I'd failed as a father, and I didn't want you to see that. I didn't want you to see how bad things were. I didn't want to disappoint you." Rick exhaled, slow and steady. "Evan, what you went through would have broken most men." "That's not an excuse," Evan said, voice breaking. "I should have trusted you. I should have told you everything. And I'm sorry, Dad, I really am." Silence settled between them, not tense but thick with emotion. Rick stepped closer, placing a strong hand on Evan's shoulder. "I forgive you, son. I forgave you long before you said the words." Evan blinked, surprised. "But," Rick added gently, "you don't get to shut me out again. Not like that. Not with Hazel, not with anything." His voice softened. "We move forward with honesty, all of us." Evan nodded, eyes glowing with relief. "I promise." Inside, Lara was tidying up Hazel's toys when Rick stepped back in. She looked up, her expression warm but full of unspoken gratitude. She crossed the room slowly, pausing in front of him. "Rick," she said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You saved Hazel. You saved me. You saved Evan." She swallowed, eyes glistening. "I didn't think anyone would ever fight for us the way you did." Rick shook his head. "You didn't owe me anything, Lara. You were trying to survive." "But you changed everything," she whispered. "You gave Hazel safety again." Her voice cracked. "You gave me safety again." Rick looked at her, seeing more than exhaustion. He saw recovery, resilience, hope. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "You've been fighting alone for too long." She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by her own emotion. "Hazel, she's different around you, Rick. She's calmer. She sleeps through the night now, she talks more. Rick glanced toward the couch, where Hazel was just starting to stir, her small body stretching like a waking kitten. She's finally in a home where she doesn't have to look over her shoulder, Rick said softly. Lara nodded. You're her anchor. Rick didn't respond out loud, but the words settled deep. As the weeks passed, Hazel blossomed in ways Rick hadn't expected. The quiet, trembling child who once hid behind his leg now stood on her tiptoes to reach the light switches. She began asking questions, hundreds of them, about everything she saw. She told stories, made up silly songs, pointed out birds and airplanes and imaginary animals in the yard. One day, while playing on the living room rug, she looked up at Rick and declared proudly, "I'm brave now." Rick froze, struck speechless. That small sentence carried more weight than any judge's ruling. "You always were," he whispered. "You just needed the world to be kinder." She smiled and climbed into his lap, curling against him with complete trust. Evan didn't waste a moment rebuilding what he'd lost. He took Hazel to the park, to the bookstore, to the grocery store where she pointed out every fruit she could name. He read her bedtime stories on nights she stayed with him. He apologized gently when she asked why she hadn't seen him before. He held her when she told him about hiding in the shed. Each moment healed something in him and in her. One afternoon, Hazel reached out her small hand to Evan on her own. "Daddy, play with me." Evan's face crumpled with emotion. He nodded, sitting beside her on the carpet as she handed him toy blocks. Rick watched from the doorway, feeling something warm fill his chest. This was what family was supposed to look like. Not fear, not hiding, not panic, but rebuilding, reclaiming, healing. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Denver rooftops, the family gathered around Rick's old wooden table for dinner. Hazel sat between Evan and Rick, kicking her feet happily under the chair. Lara laughed softly at something Hazel said. Evan reached across the table and squeezed Rick's forearm gently. "Thank you," he murmured. Rick looked at the three of them, the broken pieces that had pulled themselves together into something whole again. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep, peaceful certainty settle in his bones. The danger had passed. The wounds were healing. The family was becoming a family again. And tomorrow there would be more healing, more connection, more love. The next stage wasn't about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding. Together, the weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Rick hadn't experienced in years, a rhythm that felt earned, gentle, and quietly restorative. Every Wednesday afternoon, without fail, Evan dropped Hazel off at Rick's house for their special day, a tradition Hazel embraced like it had always existed. Rick prepared for it the way some men prepared for holidays. Her favorite snacks lined the pantry. Her crayons and markers filled a drawer he labeled with her name. And the small bedroom he'd created for her always had fresh sheets, because Hazel insisted her stuffed rabbit liked a clean bed every week. Rick would laugh, pretending to take notes. Their days together unfolded with an ease Rick never expected at his age. They baked cookies, Hazel spilling more flour on the floor than into the bowl. They built small forts with blankets draped over chairs. They fed birds in the yard while Hazel narrated every flutter and chirp as if she understood them personally. One afternoon, while she sat on the living room rug drawing crooked flowers, Rick walked past with a basket of folded laundry. She looked up casually, like she'd been saying it forever. "Grandpa, look what I made." Rick stopped cold. He set the basket down slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement would ruin the moment. "What did you say, sweetheart?" he asked softly. She held up her drawing, 3 giant flowers, a sun with too many rays, and 2 stick figures holding hands. "Your grandpa," she repeated, smiling as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. Rick's vision blurred for a moment. He knelt beside her, studying the picture carefully. "Which one is me?" Hazel tapped the taller stick figure with a bold circle for a head. "The happy one." Rick pulled her into his arms, swallowing against a sudden tightness in his throat. She rested her cheek against his shoulder like she belonged there. And in that moment, Rick felt his heart crack open in the best way possible. Lara healed quietly in the background, small steps, steady ones. Evan helped her rebuild routines she'd lost over the years. Regular meals, scheduled breaks, time for herself that didn't involve fear or looking over her shoulder. Rick watched their transformation from a distance that wasn't distant at all. He saw the tension leave Lara's face little by little. He saw Evan finally breathe normally again, no longer flinching at every unexpected sound. There was a softness between them now, not forced, not romantic, just a genuine shared sense of survival and rebuilding. One afternoon, Lara pulled Rick aside while Hazel and Evan played in the yard. "You gave me my life back," she said quietly. "Both of you. I never thought I'd see this kind of peace again." Rick shook his head. "You rebuilt it. I just helped you breathe long enough to start." She smiled, a tired but hopeful smile. "Hazel, she lights up around you. You know that, right?" Rick didn't answer, because he didn't have words for what Hazel meant to him. But Lara seemed to understand anyway. When Rick met Detective Wallace a week later at a downtown cafe to close out the last of the case notes, the air felt lighter. Wallace handed him a thin folder, nothing like the bulging files from months earlier. "That's everything," she said. "Marlon's charges are finalized. The case is officially closed." Rick nodded. "Good, he'll never get near her again." Wallace studied him a moment. "Rick, you did more than most people could have. You kept a child safe. You helped a family get back on its feet. That matters." Rick looked out the window toward the street, watching people pass by, busy, careless, safe in ways they didn't even realize. "I didn't do it for the thanks," he said quietly. "I did it because she needed someone who wouldn't run." Wallace smiled. "Then you were exactly who she needed." Life didn't snap back to perfect. It wasn't supposed to. But it became steady, warm in a way Rick hadn't expected to feel again in his 70s. Hazel's laughter filled his home every week. Her small hand gripping his finger during walks became his favorite part of the day. Her stories, half nonsense, half wonder, made him smile in ways he thought he'd forgotten how. One evening, after Evan picked her up, Rick stood in the doorway long after the car pulled away. The house was quiet again, but not in the lonely way it used to be. Now it was the quiet of a full day, of a heart that had been stretched and mended and stretched again, only to find it still beat stronger than ever. Hazel was becoming part of his rhythm, part of his healing, part of his purpose. And as he turned off the porch light, he realized something simple and profound. Life finally felt whole again. The scent of roasted turkey and warm cinnamon drifted through Rick's house long before anyone arrived. He hadn't hosted Thanksgiving since his wife passed, hadn't felt the joy or the reason or the warmth that made holidays worth the effort. But this year was different. This year, his home wasn't just a house, it pulsed with life again. Hazel's tiny footsteps pattered down the hallway as she peeked into the kitchen, wearing an apron far too big for her. Rick chuckled, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You about ready to help me mash the potatoes?" he asked. Hazel nodded seriously like she'd been given a sacred mission. "I'm really strong now," she said, holding up both fists for emphasis. Rick laughed, the sound surprising him with its fullness. "I know you are." As they worked, Hazel attacking the potatoes with exaggerated concentration, Rick looked around the kitchen and felt something he hadn't in a long time: true, unforced happiness. By the time Evan and Lara arrived, snow had begun dusting the edges of the driveway. Evan carried a pie. Lara carried a nervous smile. Hazel ran to them, wrapping her arms around their legs before pulling them inside to show the dinner table she'd helped decorate with construction paper leaves. When they finally sat down, plates full, the room warmed by candlelight and quiet music, Rick felt the moment settle around him like a soft blanket. It wasn't loud or extravagant. It was simple, whole, healing. Hazel climbed into his lap as if it were her assigned seat, hugging her stuffed rabbit as she rested against his chest. "Grandpa does grace," she announced confidently, looking around the table. Rick blinked, surprised. Evan smiled. Lara covered her heart with one hand. "You don't have to if you're not comfortable," Lara whispered. But Rick shook his head. "No, I want to." Everyone bowed their heads. Hazel stayed snuggled tight in his arms, her hands folded in her tiny version of prayer. Rick cleared his throat softly. "I'm thankful," he said slowly, "for the chance to sit here with my family again, for the second chances we didn't know we'd get, and for this little girl," he kissed the top of Hazel's head, "who brought all of us back together." Hazel squeezed his arm. Lara wiped a tear. Evan stared at the table, swallowing hard. When Rick finished, the room stayed quiet for a long moment, quiet in a way that meant something, the kind of silence filled with emotion instead of emptiness. Evan was the first to break it. "Dad," he said, voice trembling, "there's something I want to say, and I want to say it here today." Rick looked up. "You saved us," Evan continued. "Not just from Marlon, not just from danger. You saved us from losing ourselves. You gave Hazel safety. You gave Lara hope. You gave me a chance to be a father again." Lara nodded, her eyes brimming. "It's true, Rick. I don't think any of us would be sitting here if it weren't for you." Rick felt the weight of their gratitude, but he didn't let it sweep him away. He rested a hand on Hazel's back. "You all fought just as hard. I didn't do this alone." Hazel looked up at him with a proud little smile. "You're my hero, Grandpa." Those 4 words struck deeper than any courtroom praise, any legal recognition. They anchored him, softened him, restored something inside him he hadn't realized was still wounded. During dessert, Hazel insisted he try every pie just to be sure, smearing whipped cream on his cheek when she giggled too hard. The laughter that followed, Evan's deep chuckle, Lara's light laugh, Hazel's squeal, filled the house with the kind of joy Rick had only ever dreamed of hearing again. Later, as they cleared the table, Rick paused at the framed photograph hanging near the fireplace, the picture of his late wife smiling on their 40th anniversary. He touched the frame gently, leaning in until his forehead brushed the glass. "Thank you," he whispered, "for sending her to me, for bringing them all back." He wasn't sure if he believed in signs, but he felt something warm in the room, something quiet, familiar, comforting. When he returned to the table, Hazel tugged at his hand. "Sit next to me," she demanded. He did. Lara poured more cider. Evan told a story from when he and his dad camped in the Rockies. Hazel laughed so hard she fell into Rick's lap again. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, Rick didn't feel like something was missing. He felt complete. The morning light was soft, draping Denver's quiet streets in a calm warmth that felt almost unreal after the months they'd survived. Rick walked slowly down the sidewalk, Hazel's small hand curled tightly around 2 of his fingers. Her steps were tiny but determined, her little shoes tapping lightly against the concrete. She swung her stuffed rabbit in her other hand, humming a tune she seemed to invent on the spot. The world felt gentler today. Maybe because he finally allowed himself to feel it. They reached the entrance of the neighborhood park, just a simple stretch of green with swings, a slide, and a winding walking path. But to Hazel, it might as well have been an entire kingdom. Her eyes widened, glowing with excitement. "Grandpa, can we go to the swings first?" she asked, tugging his hand like she feared he'd say no. Rick smiled. "We can go anywhere you want." She giggled and skipped ahead a few steps, pulling him along. Her joy was so bright it softened every memory of fear, every dark moment they'd endured. Watching her now, free, unburdened, safe, felt like witnessing a miracle he hadn't dared pray for. Halfway to the swings, Hazel stopped abruptly. She looked up at him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "Grandpa," she whispered, "you'll always find me right." Rick knelt down immediately, lowering himself until they were eye to eye. He cupped her tiny cheeks gently. "Hazel," he said, voice steady and full, "I will always find you, no matter where you are, no matter what happens." His chest tightened with emotion. "I promise you always." Her eyes softened, reassured. She threw her arms around his neck with sudden force, hugging him with a trust so complete it nearly broke him. Rick held her close, breathing her in. The innocence, the warmth, the second chance he never saw coming. Because months ago, she didn't exist in his world. Now she was the center of it. As they crossed the grass toward the playground, he felt footsteps approaching behind them. Rick turned to see Evan and Lara walking side by side. No fear between them, no tension, no lingering shadows. Just two parents who had been through hell and come out willing to rebuild together. Evan lifted a hand. "Hey, Dad." Hazel pulled out of Rick's arms and ran straight toward her father, squealing, "Daddy." Evan scooped her up and spun her gently, her laughter rising into the crisp morning air. Lara watched them with a smile that didn't have to fight through pain anymore. She turned to Rick. "She slept through the night again," Lara said softly. "No nightmares, no crying." Rick nodded, a quiet pride settling in his chest. "She's healing." "She's healing because of you," Lara added. "You gave her a place where she could breathe again." Rick looked at Hazel, at the way she clung to her dad's shirt as she giggled, at how safe she looked in both their arms. "She gave me something too, Lara." Lara tilted her head. "What's that?" "A reason to keep going." Lara touched his arm. "You gave all of us one." They walked together toward the swings, Rick feeling a completeness settle around him. A fullness he hadn't felt since the days when his wife was still alive, still filling their home with laughter and warmth. Hazel ran back to him, grabbing his hand again. "Grandpa, swing me." Her excitement was contagious. Rick lifted her easily, placing her gently in the small bucket swing. She kicked her legs impatiently. "Higher," she said. He pushed slowly at first, then a little higher, watching her face tilt up toward the sky. Her smile, wide, bright, fearless, hit him right in the chest. Evan stood beside him. "Dad, you know, if there's one thing I learned through all this, it's that I should have told you sooner. She needed you, and his voice cracked. I needed you too." Rick didn't look away from Hazel. "You gave me something I didn't know I was missing." Evan nodded. "A granddaughter." Rick smiled, the kind of smile that came from the deepest place inside him, the place that had been empty for so long. Hazel pumped her little legs, shouting, "Look at me, I'm flying." Rick pushed the swing a little higher, feeling the sun warm his back, feeling Lara and Evan close by, feeling life finally knit itself into something whole again. And as Hazel soared forward, laughter echoing across the park, Rick found the words forming inside him, words meant for himself, for the past, for the road they survived. "He hid a grandchild from me, but she became the light that saved all of us."